In the summer of 1984, a grim mystery unfolded behind the walls of a secretive nuclear plant in rural Ohio. 39-year-old Dave Box, a hard-working union pipe fitter and devoted father of three, vanished during an overnight shift at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center. Days later, investigators made a horrifying discovery inside this secretive Ohio operation. They found bone fragments, a melted pair of glasses, pieces of a walkie-talkie, and a set of keys recovered from deep inside a furnace heated to 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit. The official investigation couldn't conclusively determine how Dave ended up in the furnace, and authorities eventually ruled out foul play for lack of evidence. But to Dave's family, friends, and many others, the notion that he climbed into the blistering uranium processing furnace on his own never rang true. Decades later, questions still linger about whether Dave Box was silenced for what he knew. Born in 1944, Dave grew up in Ohio and eventually married and had 3 children. Though he divorced in 1979, Dave remained close with his ex-wife and kids, staying involved in their lives. By 1981, he'd landed a steady job as a pipe fitter at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, about 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati. This was the area's major employer, yet few locals knew its true nature. With its innocuous-sounding name and a red and white checkered water tower resembling a pet food logo, many assumed Fernald was some kind of feed or fertilizer plant. In reality, Fernald was a top-secret nuclear facility. From the 1950s through the 1980s, this 1,000-acre site processed high-grade uranium for America's atomic arsenal, all under tight government secrecy. Employees were briefed that the work involved low-level radiation and were sworn to silence about plant activities. By all accounts, Dave excelled in his role as a maintenance pipe fitter at Fernald. His job took him throughout the 8 plants on the site. He was to inspect and repair pumps, dust collectors, and other equipment, including safety systems used in uranium processing. He quickly earned the respect of his coworkers for his reliability and conscientiousness. Dave was also known as a stickler for the rules, and he was someone who took safety extremely seriously and looked out for others. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Dave showed every sign of an ordinary man excited about the future. He'd just remodeled his house, paid all his bills for the month, and even bought a brand new lunchbox for work. If Dave had any worries about his job at Fernald, he didn't share them widely, but Fernald in the 1980s wasn't a typical workplace. Unbeknownst to most, the plant was an environmental time bomb. Its uranium operations emitted radioactive contaminants into the air and water, well beyond safe limits. In fact, just a few months after Dave's death, Fernald was rocked by a scandal. A factory mishap in late 1984 released a cloud of radioactive dust over the countryside. Investigators later revealed the plant had been spewing more than 200 tons of radioactive material into the environment over the years. Trust in the facility and its federal overseers evaporated practically overnight. On Sunday, June 17, 1984, Dave prepared for another midnight shift at Fernald. He met up with his carpool partner, fellow maintenance man Harry Easterling, at a local restaurant around 11 p.m., as they often did. The 2 men rode to work together in Harry's truck. During the drive, Harry noticed nothing unusual in Dave's demeanor. Dave chatted about taking his kids on vacation and mentioned that new lunchbox he'd bought, extremely ordinary small talk between friends. By 11:25 p.m., they arrived at the plant, changed into work clothes, and went through the routine security and decontamination process to start their shift. Shortly after midnight, in the early minutes of Monday, June 18th, Dave and Harry collected their assignments in the maintenance shop. That night, Dave was tasked with checking a pump in Plant 8, while Harry headed to a job in another part of the facility. Before splitting up, Dave opened his toolbox and, as was his habit, removed the padlock from it and set his keys in the lock on the toolbox lid. Those keys, for his car, his locker padlocks, and likely his house, would later become a critical and confounding piece of evidence. Through the pre-dawn hours, only a skeleton crew was at Fernald. At around 4 a.m., a fellow worker passing by noticed something a bit odd. He spotted Dave sitting in a parked pickup truck with his supervisor, Charlie Shoes. The two men appeared to be having an intense conversation. It was a warm, humid night, yet the truck's windows were rolled up, possibly to keep the conversation private. The employee couldn't hear what was being discussed, but it struck him as serious. Not long after, around 4:30 a.m., Harry Easterling and Dave crossed paths for their scheduled meal break. They clocked back in at about 4:46 a.m., after which they headed off to resume separate tasks. That was the last time Harry saw his friend. Sometime just before 5 a.m., Dave Box was seen one more time. The same worker who had witnessed the truck meeting ran into Dave on the grounds and offered to help him with his work if needed. Dave, who was walking in the direction of Plant 4, not Plant 8 where he'd initially been assigned, responded casually that everything was okay. A short while later, at roughly 5:10 a.m., an anomalous event occurred inside Plant 6, the building housing a high-temperature furnace used for uranium processing. Plant 6 wasn't on Dave's work schedule that night, yet it would soon become the focus of dire attention. Instrument records later showed that at about 5:15 a.m., the temperature in the Plant 6 molten salt furnace abruptly dropped about 28 degrees before returning to normal. Such a dip might happen if something foreign, something with a lot of mass at room temperature, was suddenly dumped into the 1,350-degree furnace. Around the same time, a furnace operator noticed an odd, sticky black residue on the furnace lid and caught a whiff of an unusual odor in the area. He even remarked that what he saw on the lip of the furnace looked like a leg, according to later statements. Startled, the operator alerted a supervisor, but the supervisor was oddly unconcerned. He told the worker to ignore it and keep the furnace running. And so, as dawn broke on June 18th, no immediate action was taken, but Dave Box was nowhere to be found. When the overnight shift ended at 7 a.m. on June 18th, the crew gathered for a routine safety meeting in Plant 4, but Dave never showed up. At first, Harry Easterling assumed his friend had gotten tied up working overtime. After the meeting, Harry returned to the maintenance area and noticed Dave's toolbox still sitting where it was left, lid open. Sure enough, the padlock and Dave's keys were still resting on top, a sign Dave hadn't yet packed up to leave. Keep these facts in mind, because they're going to be important in this mystery going forward. Harry made a few calls around the plant, but couldn't find anyone who had seen Dave. Pressed for time because of an appointment, Harry scribbled a note to Dave and left it on the toolbox, saying he'd waited but had to leave and would be back later. Harry then headed out, concerned but hoping there was a simple explanation for his friend's absence. That evening, however, when Harry returned to the usual carpool rendezvous spot, Dave's car was already there and parked as usual for their nightly meetup. It was Dave's turn to drive that night, but something was off. Dave was nowhere to be found, and the car's hood and fenders felt cool to the touch, indicating the vehicle hadn't been driven recently. Dave had clearly left his car there long before and never returned to it. Alarmed, Harry rushed to work and officially reported Dave Box as a missing person. Plant security helped pry open Dave's locker, where they found the clothes Dave had worn the night before, neatly left behind. The company finally began a full search of the premises, but there was still no trace of the missing pipe fitter. Only then, with Dave unaccounted for, did attention turn back to the mysterious incident at Plant 6 that same morning. By the night of Tuesday, June 19th, management informed the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department of a potential crisis. On Wednesday, June 20th, authorities shut down the furnace in Plant 6, suspecting that Dave's disappearance and the furnace's strange behavior were linked. It took 3 days for the molten salt inside the furnace to cool and solidify enough to examine. What investigators found once they opened it confirmed everyone's worst fears. Within the hardened cake of material were unmistakable human remains and personal items. Among them were several small bone fragments, the steel toe from a boot, part of a metal eyeglass frame, pieces of a two-way radio, and an alligator clip from a work ID badge. Also discovered was a set of keys that, incredibly, matched Dave Box's car and padlocks. One key even appeared to be a house key of Dave's, though the damage from the heat was far too severe to ever confirm this. The recovery of Dave's keys from inside the furnace only deepened the mystery. If the temperature drop in the furnace occurred around 5 a.m., that likely marked the moment something, or someone, entered it. But Dave's keys had reportedly been seen after that time. Harry Easterling was adamant that around 7:30 that morning, he personally saw Dave's keys sitting on the toolbox in the maintenance room. The troubling implication was that someone might have retrieved Dave's keys from the toolbox after Harry left and tossed them into the furnace to destroy evidence. It was a chilling thought, one that suggested deliberate foul play. By the end of that week, on June 22, 1984, investigators had to break the devastating news to the Box family. The Fernald facility, once secretive, was now swarming with law enforcement personnel and besieged by questions. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department launched an investigation with the limited evidence available. Detectives spent nearly a year interviewing workers and combing through facility records. From the start, the case was fraught with complications. Because it was a Department of Energy site involved in classified nuclear work, there was an extremely high degree of secrecy and security clearances to navigate. Investigators were given a 351-page file of documents from the plant, but suspicion lingered that not everyone was fully cooperative. Despite the mysterious circumstances, plant management and some law enforcement officials leaned towards the potential that Dave did it himself. Lacking a clear motive or any evidence of any violence, the sheriff's office eventually concluded there was no concrete evidence that he had been forced into the furnace. The authorities looked heavily into Dave's mental health history during the investigative process, and it was significant. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier and reportedly suffered occasional hallucinations. Around the time of his divorce in the late 1970s, he experienced a severe mental health emergency. But by 1984, those who knew Dave insist he had turned a corner. He was on regular medication and in counseling, and his ex-wife and children said he was stable and optimistic. Dave hadn't had any breakdowns or mental health crises in the years leading up to his death. He had many future plans, including a summer vacation with his kids, and had taken steps to continue renovations on his home. He had none of the telltale signs of someone preparing to end it all, though of course sometimes people with that sort of ideation deliberately make things appear very normal. The reasoning being, of course, not to set off any alarm bells from loved ones who would obviously intervene. Even Dave's psychiatrist reportedly agreed that Dave seemed to be in a good place in the months leading up to this event. That said, it's unclear when the last time Dave attended with his psychiatrist was, and for someone like Dave, who had no acute ongoing problems, it could be months between appointments. The authorities also investigated the possibility of an accident, but found it highly unlikely. The furnace in Plant 6 was about 4 feet tall, with a heavy lid covering most of its top. The only opening was a narrow hatch roughly 9 by 22 inches across. To end up inside, Dave would have had to climb a ladder and then contort or force his body through that small gap. It would have been difficult for anyone, let alone a stocky man in work boots, to accidentally fall in. It was determined that he would have perished virtually instantly while trying to stuff himself into the furnace. This, of course, left the unnerving possibility that arises when you realize he couldn't have fit himself in there either intentionally on his part or by accident. Many in the investigation suspected Dave was slain, and then his body was stuffed into the furnace to destroy the evidence of the crime. A lot of criminals attempt to use various forms of fire and heat to cover the evidence of their misdeeds to varying degrees of success. Not a lot of perpetrators have access to a superheated furnace that can truly wipe away virtually any element of forensic evidence, though. If Dave's body had been inserted into the furnace, the heat wiped away all evidence. Surprisingly, given the secure nature of the facility and the fact that it was an important site for national security, it appears that this area had no security cameras. While cameras clearly weren't as widespread as today, they had already seen mass adoption in the 1980s, which makes me question why there wasn't footage from a nuclear site. While I have no trouble believing that every inch of the facility wasn't covered, I find it very odd that there were no sightings of him on camera during the relevant time periods. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain Dave Box's fate. The one that Dave's children and many co-workers believe is straightforward. Dave was silenced because he knew too much about Fernald's dirty secrets. In this theory, Dave, the rule-following maintenance man who monitored radioactive dust systems, may have discovered alarming information about Plant 8's operations. Notably, Plant 8 was later identified as a major source of uranium emissions, releasing 4 times more radioactive contaminants than any other building at Fernald. Perhaps Dave had seen data or physically observed unsafe practices that he felt were endangering workers and the public. If he intended to blow the whistle, either to authorities or the press, it could have threatened the plant's secret. It's known that Dave was vocal about safety. He'd even confronted a colleague for slacking off on the job and wasn't afraid to report violations to supervisors. Some speculate he might have approached his boss or others about the pollution issue and met deadly resistance. Suspicion often centers on the last people to see Dave alive. On the top of that list is his supervisor, Charlie Shoes, who some have alleged was involved. Shoes spoke with Dave twice in the early morning hours of June 18th, once in that closed-up truck around 4 a.m., and again for about 10 minutes inside Plant 4 not long after 5. In fact, Shoes himself admitted to talking to Dave right around the very time the furnace temperature dropped in Plant 6. If anyone had the opportunity to ambush Dave and dispose of him quickly, a supervisor with freedom to move around the site may fit that role. However, these are just suspicions, and there's nothing concrete to back these allegations. Another name that arose was Ernie Gibson, a co-worker with whom Dave had clashed. Dave had recently complained to management about Gibson sleeping on the job, which led to Gibson's suspension. In what potentially qualifies as an eerie coincidence, Gibson was suspended on the very shift that Dave died. One witness thought he saw Gibson's motorcycle parked at the plant that night, despite the suspension, raising suspicions that Gibson might have snuck in for revenge. Police did visit Gibson's home and found his motorcycle there, but the vehicle wasn't in working order, and they ruled him out. He wasn't questioned further beyond this once it was found out that his bike was broken down, and some speculate that he wasn't investigated sufficiently. That said, I personally find this theory to be extremely weak. If Gibson entered the facility, it would have presumably been logged in some way, and I suspect that when he was suspended from work, his credentials were temporarily revoked. Further, No one reported seeing Gibson on the site that night, and the entirety of this evidence rests on the fact that someone, quote, thought they saw his motorcycle. It also appears that Gibson was entirely cooperative with the investigation and had absolutely nothing to hide about his dislike for Dave. In the aftermath of Dave Box's death, life in Fernald, Ohio changed forever. Just 5 months later, the government was forced to reveal the plant's actual operations amid the pollution scandal. A flurry of lawsuits and investigations followed, and it turned out this industrial site turned the grounds into a toxic dump. The once bustling feed materials production center ground to a halt and was permanently shut down in 1989, its mission rendered obsolete and its reputation irreparably tarnished. The site would later undergo a transformation into one of the nation's largest Superfund sites, eventually becoming the Fernald Nature Preserve. Officially, the case of Dave Box is closed pending new evidence and remains one of Ohio's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just plugging Lazy Chill True Crime, which is available everywhere you get your podcasts. It includes my true crime-related content from this channel and my content from my dedicated true crime YouTube channel, as well as bonus content not heard anywhere else. Just search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts. Tokyo, July 1949. 4 years into the Allied occupation, the summer sun beat down on a city still scarred by conflict. On the morning of July 5th, a black limousine pulled up outside Nihonbashi's Mitsukoshi department store. Out stepped Sadanori Shimoyama, the president of the Japanese National Railways Corporation, who told his driver to wait as he walked into the store. He was supposedly shopping for a birthday gift for his wife, but he never returned. Just after midnight, his body was found on the railroad tracks on the city's outskirts. Was this the result of a desperate act by a man under unbearable pressure, or the result of a sinister plot by any number of actors looking to consolidate power in the lean years of the occupation? By 1949, Japan was experiencing growing strains under the Allied occupation. The early post-war push for democracy had given way to Cold War anxieties. American authorities under General Douglas MacArthur and Japanese leaders grew fearful of the rising Japanese Communist Party and labor union militancy. Strikes and protests were on the rise, prompting a reverse-course crackdown that curtailed union rights. The Japanese Communist Party's unexpected leap in parliamentary seats that year only heightened these fears. At the same time, the economy was in crisis. That year, the occupation forces prescribed a harsh austerity program to curb inflation. This budget cut public spending and wiped out thousands of jobs, and one of its first targets was Japan's sprawling national railway. On July 4, 1949, Shimoyama, just weeks into his new job as JNR president, announced the dismissal of 30,000 employees virtually overnight. This was a reduction ordered by occupation authorities to both save on costs and also weaken communist influence in the labor force. Shimoyama was deeply distressed by the mass layoffs and had even received anonymous threats from those enraged by the cuts. This was the volatile backdrop against which he set out for work on July 5th. That morning, Shimoyama left home as usual, heading to the office, but he never arrived. Around 9:30 a.m., he asked his chauffeur to stop at Mitsukoshi department store in central Tokyo, then stepped out and disappeared into the crowd. Despite his driver waiting for hours, it was the last confirmed sighting of him. When Shimoyama missed his meeting and couldn't be found by late afternoon, a frantic search began. News of the missing railway chief spread quickly, and the public was stunned that such a powerful figure could vanish in broad daylight. Unconfirmed reports later surfaced of a man resembling him seen wandering the city that day, but none could be verified, and as night fell, the mystery deepened. In the early minutes of July 6th, the worst fears were realized. Around 12:30 a.m., a train driver on the Joban line spotted something on the tracks between Kitasenju and Ayase stations. It was a human body, and investigators soon identified the remains as Shimoyama. Japan woke up to the shocking twist that the missing railway president had been run over by his own train. The authorities launched an intensive investigation, with U.S. occupation officers working alongside Tokyo police. But from the outset, they encountered baffling clues. One medical examiner at the scene initially suggested that Shimoyama might have leaped in front of the train, implying he had committed the act intentionally. Yet the formal autopsy swiftly contradicted that idea. It found that Shimoyama had died before being run over. Notably, very little blood was found around his mangled body, indicating his heart was not beating at the moment of impact. In other words, he may have been slain elsewhere, and his corpse laid on the tracks to be crushed to bits by the next train. That said, there's another potential explanation for this evidence that also potentially makes sense, which I'll get to in a moment. Despite months of effort and scores of detectives on the case, police were unable to crack the mystery. Every lead turned into a dead end, and no witnesses could definitively place Shimoyama with anyone, or explain how he ended up where he did that night. There was no note either from himself or from abductors, and no obvious suspect. In the politically charged atmosphere, the police kept their findings close to the vest and never officially announced any conclusion. In 1964, 15 years after the fact, the statute of limitations expired with the Shimoyama case still unsolved, and the case was officially shut, without any real sense of closure. Over the ensuing decades, several theories have endured. The first theory suggests that he did it himself. Under this view, Shimoyama broke under the immense pressure and guilt of his job. He'd been tasked by the occupation authorities with putting tens of thousands out of work and faced vilification and threats. It's conceivable that by July 5th he saw no other way out. To this day, many consider this a plausible explanation. However, this doesn't necessarily explain why the autopsy findings indicated that he was already dead while on the tracks. That said, there's no indication that any toxicology test was conducted, and some have speculated that he may have taken a lethal dose of a substance prior to going to the track. Under this theory, Shimoyama, who was a conscientious man, didn't want to burden the train operator with the guilt of being the responsible party. That said, he wanted to send a message loud and clear about why he committed the act. So under this theory, he had to have his body mangled by one of his trains. Of course, this doesn't explain why he didn't leave a note or tell anyone that this was his intention. This point does lead down another rabbit hole as well, since some have speculated that a note was found. The contents of this speculative note are of course completely unknown, but it's been suggested he may have blamed the occupation authorities, or even issued support for trade unionists. Under this theory, this note would have had a destabilizing effect, and it was suppressed for political reasons, which of course brings me to those reasons. Another line of speculation blames communists for the attack. In 1949, suspicions immediately fell on those most enraged by the JNR layoffs. Perhaps, it was argued, vengeful fired workers under the direction of the Japanese Communist Party activists abducted Shimoyama as payback. This idea was eagerly embraced by U.S. occupation officials and Japan's government at the time, who pointed to a communist plot. In fact, the Shimoyama incident became a pretext for cracking down harder on leftist unions and the Communist Party. The climate of the era lent some significant weight to the theory that the communists were behind this action. While the Japanese Communist Party would renounce violence and revolution in 1955, in 1949 they still saw themselves as a revolutionary vanguard group set on overthrowing capitalism directly. Further, given the harsh conditions of the era, as mentioned, they had experienced significant electoral success as well. There were also indications that the Shimoyama incident may have been part of a broader campaign against the railway infrastructure. Within weeks, two other mysterious rail disasters, a runaway train at Mitaka and a derailment at Matsukawa, were blamed on alleged communist saboteurs. Although those cases later fell apart for lack of evidence, they reinforced the narrative that extremists were undermining Japan's railways. Notably, others have proposed that those subsequent events were caused by the massive layoffs, which potentially cut crucial personnel. Some others have contended that anti-communist elements, perhaps Japanese ultra-nationalists in an unholy alliance with American occupation forces, orchestrated the incident. According to this theory, the conspirators kidnapped Shimoyama and made it look like communists did it, in order to turn public sentiment against the left. While no direct proof has ever emerged, the idea of an occupation-era cover-up continues to intrigue people. The Shimoyama incident was never solved, but it left a lasting mark on Japan. Observers have since called Shimoyama's death a pivotal moment in the occupation era, one that profoundly altered Japan's political trajectory. In its immediate aftermath, the authorities used the incident to accelerate a purge of communists and their sympathizers from positions of influence. Thousands lost their jobs, including hundreds of railway workers identified as troublemakers. In the end, Shimoyama's unsolved death became known to history as the Shimoyama Incident because of this outsized impact on Japanese history. In fact, the case can be made that it had an outsized impact on world history, since there was a realistic possibility in 1949 of Japan fracturing much like Korea did. Only after this incident, and the subsequent train incidents, was the communist influence in Japan largely quelled.